In 1944, somewhere in the South Pacific, a young Navy sailor stood at the edge of a freshly conquered island and watched a yellow machine tear through dense jungle. Within hours, where century-old trees and impenetrable mud had stood, there was a runway, flat, graded, operational. Aircraft could land. The war could move forward. The machine had no name painted on its side. It didn't need one. Every soldier, sailor, and engineer present knew exactly what it was. It was a caterpillar. It was the tractor that built the world. At that same moment, on the other side of the Pacific, another caterpillar was helping lay the foundations of a dam in China. Back in Illinois, the factories in Peoria were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing over 50,000 military tractors to sustain the Allied war effort. The company had become as essential to modern civilization as steel and concrete. Its name had stopped being just a brand name. It had become a verb. A concept. A synonym for the act of reshaping the earth itself. For decades, Caterpillar was not merely a company. It was a geological force. Its machines opened highways through the Andes, helped construct the Hoover Dam, reached Antarctica, and operated in places where no human being had ever imagined it would be possible to work. In nearly 200 countries, whenever the earth needed moving, whenever dams needed raising, whenever entire civilizations needed building from nothing, a yellow machine with the CAT logo was there. Then something began to change. Silently at first, almost imperceptibly, and later with a force that shook an entire region. Peoria, Illinois, the city that for decades had been the industrial heart of Caterpillar, would witness a slow and painful hollowing out. Hopes would migrate. Economic power would shift. And in June 2022, when the company announced that its global headquarters was leaving Illinois for Irving, Texas, thousands of people who had given their lives to that company understood that something fundamental had ended forever. This is the full story of how the United States lost the tractor that built the modern world. It is a story about invention, ambition, war, labor, globalization, and the cold mathematics of corporate survival. And it begins not in Illinois, but in a muddy California field in 1904. The problem that started everything. Benjamin Holt was born in New Hampshire into a family of timber entrepreneurs. From early in his life he developed an obsessive fascination with machinery, how it worked, how it could be improved, what problems it could solve that human hands alone could not. When he moved to California in the 1880s, he brought that curiosity with him along with a fierce commercial ambition. The problem he wanted to solve was deceptively simple to describe and brutally difficult to crack. How do you move a heavy machine across soft, wet ground without it sinking? The farmland around Stockton in California's San Joaquin Valley was among the most fertile in the world, but it was also frequently waterlogged. A steam-powered tractor could weigh 20 tons, an unsaturated solid would sink like a stone dropped in still water. The wheels that worked perfectly on firm ground became useless anchors on mud. Holt experimented for years: wider wheels, wooden platforms bolted around the circumference, exotic multi-wheel configurations. Nothing worked adequately. Then, in noviembre de 1904, he tested an idea that would change the world. He replaced the rear wheels of a steam tractor with a continuous loop of wooden planks attached to chains. A track that wrapped around the underside of the machine and laid itself down in front of the wheels as they moved. Instead of concentrating the machine's entire weight on a small contact point, the track distributed it across a large surface area. The machine no longer sank. It crawled. When the company photographer, Charles Clements, watched that first prototype moving across the field, he remarked aloud that it moved like a caterpillar. Holt heard the comment, turned around, and said, "Caterpillar. That's the name." He registered the trademark in 1910 and opened a manufacturing facility in East Peoria, Illinois, that began with just 12 employees. Within 2 years, that factory employed 625 people and was already exporting tractors to Argentina, Canada, and Mexico. Holt had solved a mechanical problem. He had also, without fully realizing it yet, created the technological foundation for an entirely new category of machine. One that would reshape every major conflict, every major construction project, and every major landscape of the 20th century. The rival he would eventually need. While Holt was building his empire in Northern California, another entrepreneur was doing the same thing just a few counties away. Clarence Leo Best was the son of Daniel Best, one of the original pioneers of agricultural mechanization on the West Coast. He had grown up around machinery, understood it instinctively, and had no intention of letting Holt dominate the market. The two companies, Holt Manufacturing and CL Best Tractor, were fierce competitors for nearly 2 decades. They sued each other repeatedly over patents. They undercut each other's prices. They competed aggressively for every major customer. The rivalry was personal as well as commercial, and it drained both companies of resources that, in retrospect, might have been better spent elsewhere. By the early 1920s, both sides of the conflict had arrived at the same conclusion: the competition was weakening them at precisely the moment when the market was beginning to attract serious outside attention. In 1925, after prolonged negotiations, the boards of both companies made a historic decision. The Holt Manufacturing Company and the CL Best Tractor Company would merge into a single entity. On April 15, 1925, the Caterpillar Tractor Company was formally incorporated, with headquarters in Peoria, Illinois. The new company inherited the patent portfolios, dealer networks, manufacturing facilities, and technical knowledge of both founding companies. More importantly, it inherited them at a moment when America was building everything it could build: dams, bridges, highways, railroads, mechanized farms from coast to coast. Demand for heavy equipment was almost unlimited. The timing was extraordinary. The merger was extraordinary. And nobody on earth could have predicted what was coming next, because what came next was the worst economic catastrophe in modern history: Stalin, the Depression, and the diesel engine. When the American economy collapsed in 1929, Caterpillar lost its domestic market almost overnight. Construcción stopped. Farming contracted. Companies across every sector slashed capital expenditure. The orders that had been flowing into Peoria steadily for 4 years dried up. The company needed new customers, and it found them in the most unexpected place imaginable. Joseph Stalin had launched the Soviet Union's first 5-year plan, a brutal program of forced industrialization that required industrial machinery in quantities the country could not produce domestically. Caterpillar supplied over 2,000 machines to the Soviet government between 1929 and 1932, keeping the company financially viable during the darkest years of the Depression. The irony is almost too rich for a history book. The All-American Tractor Company from the heartland of the United States was financially rescued by the communist state it would one day face as a geopolitical adversary. Those same machines helped build Soviet industrial capacity at precisely the moment American industrial capacity was contracting. History rarely moves in straight lines. The real technological breakthrough of that period came in 1931, when Caterpillar launched its first diesel-powered tractor. The diesel engine had been around since the 1890s, but it remained experimental and commercially marginal for most applications. Caterpillar's engineers had been working on diesel tractor development for years, at costs that nearly caused the project to be cancelled multiple times. The finished product was transformative. Diesel was more fuel-efficient than gasoline, far more economical over long operating hours, and capable of sustaining higher loads without overheating. Within a decade, the diesel engine had become the universal standard for heavy vehicles of every kind. Trucks, construction equipment, marine vessels, generators, locomotives. Caterpillar had not merely adopted the diesel engine. It had demonstrated, at commercial scale and in demanding real-world conditions, that diesel was the future of heavy machinery. That demonstration echoed through the entire industrial world for the rest of the century. World War II. The company that helped win the war, the Second World War, placed demands on Caterpillar that would have seemed impossible to meet before the conflict began. The company's Illinois factories ran 3 shifts, 7 days a week, without interruption from December 1941 through August 1945. More than 50,000 military tractors were manufactured in that period. The diesel engines powering the Sherman tank, the most widely produced Allied tank of the war, with over 49,000 units built, were Caterpillar units. Caterpillar generators powered field hospitals, command centers, and communications equipment across every theater of the war. But the contribution that receives the least attention in popular histories of the conflict is arguably the most strategically significant of all. The U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, were the engineering force that made the entire Pacific campaign physically possible. Their job was to arrive on captured islands and turn jungle into operational military infrastructure fast enough to support the next phase of the advance. They built airstrips, fuel depots, barracks, port facilities, and roads, often while the fighting was still in progress nearby. Their primary tools were Caterpillar bulldozers, graders, and scrapers. On Guadalcanal, CB units completed a fighter airstrip in conditions that military planners had considered impossible. On Tinian, the runways from which the Enola Gay and Boxcar took off on the missions that ended the Pacific War were built by CBs using Caterpillar equipment. The logistics of the entire island-hopping campaign, the strategic architecture that brought American forces to Japan's doorstep, depended at its most fundamental physical level on yellow machines built in central Illinois. Caterpillar finished the war among the 50 largest USA military contractors. It had entered the conflict as a dominant commercial manufacturer. It emerged as something closer to critical national infrastructure, a company whose machines were as essential to American military capability as the aircraft carriers and bombers that history tends to remember instead. The Golden Age, building the post-war world. The end of World War II opened a commercial horizon without precedent in the company's history. Europe was destroyed. Japan was in ruins. Entire countries needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. The Marshall Plan injected billions of dollars into European reconstruction, and a substantial portion of that money flowed directly into construction equipment, predominantly Caterpillar. The global expansion that followed moved at a pace that reflected the scale of the opportunity. A United Kingdom subsidiary in 1950. Brasil en 1954. Australia en 1955. Scotland en 1956. France in 1961. By the mid-1960s, Caterpillar had manufacturing or distribution operations on every inhabited continent. In 1953, the Indian government purchased 93 Caterpillar machines for its National Highway Program, the beginning of a relationship that would grow into one of the company's most important international markets. In the early 1950s, CAT equipment carved a 10.5-kilometer highway through the Venezuelan Andes, connecting communities that had been isolated by the terrain for generations. In 1955, Operation Deep Freeze, the USA military's Antarctic program, brought Caterpillar machines to the continent, where they were used to construct McMurdo Station, still the largest research facility in Antarctica today, still operational in temperatures that drop below 50 degrees C. The company had a phrase that captured this era well, used internally and in its marketing materials. If there was anywhere on Earth where civilization needed to push its limits, Caterpillar was there. It was not a boast. It was simply a description of the record. Inside the United States, the interstate highway system, authorized by Congress in 1956 and representing the largest public works program in American history to that point, placed Caterpillar machines on construction sites from Maine to California, from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. The 77,000-kilometer network of highways that defines American geography today was built, in significant part, with equipment from Peoria. Peoria itself lived its golden age during these years. The factories expanded repeatedly. Wages were strong. Employment grew. There was genuine civic pride in being a Caterpillar city, the kind of pride that comes from knowing that the machines your neighbors built are doing consequential work on every continent. By 1970, Caterpillar's workforce had doubled compared to a decade earlier. Sales crossed $1.5 billion that year. By 1973, $3 billion. By 1975, nearly $5 billion. By 1978, approaching $6 billion. Caterpillar controlled approximately 36% of the global heavy machinery market. For every tractor, bulldozer, or excavator sold anywhere in the world, more than 1 in 3 came from Peoria. No other company was remotely close. The siege that nobody saw there was a warning that almost nobody wanted to read. In the same year that Caterpillar opened its first UK subsidiary, 1950. A Japanese company called Komatsu was being reorganized and modernized under new management. In Tokyo, a group of executives was studying Caterpillar's market position with the systematic attention of military strategists. Their internal program had a slogan that would only become public knowledge years later, after the damage was done. The slogan was Maruse, a Japanese shorthand that translated roughly as Encircle Caterpillar. The objective was explicit. Study the American company's products, match their quality, undercut their prices, and methodically take their market share in every country where they competed. It was not a vague aspiration. It was an operational plan with timelines and benchmarks. Nobody in Peoria knew this. De 1970s, the best decade in Caterpillar's history by every financial metric, unfolded against the invisible backdrop of that siege. Sales rising. Profit set records. A dramatic factory expansion program announced in 1974. More resources than ever allocated to product development in 1975. The product line the most comprehensive in the industry's history by 1978. The peak of that prosperity, the seeds of collapse were already germinating. Three simultaneous crises. The early 1980s hit Caterpillar with three distinct crises arriving almost simultaneously, each serious enough to be damaging on its own, each made dramatically worse by the presence of the other two. The first was monetary. The Federal Reserve's campaign against inflation under Chairman Paul Volcker pushed USA interest rates to historic highs and drove the value of the dollar sharply upward against other currencies. For a company that exported two-thirds of its American production, this was a slow-motion catastrophe. Every machine manufactured in Illinois automatically became more expensive for foreign buyers. Meanwhile, Komatsu, operating in a yen that had weakened significantly against the dollar, saw its export prices fall to levels that allowed it to undercut Caterpillar by 30 to 40% in international markets. In some product categories, the price gap was wide enough that a buyer could purchase a Komatsu machine and still have money left to fund several years of maintenance. The siege plan had its opening. The second crisis was structural. By 1982, Caterpillar's internal analysis showed that its total wages and benefits package cost 90% more than the equivalent at Komatsu in Japan. 90%. In markets where a 5% cost advantage can determine the outcome of a major contract bid, a 90% structural disadvantage is not a problem to be managed. It is a problem that will eventually prove fatal unless addressed at the root. The relationship between Caterpillar and the United Auto Workers Union had been complicated since 1942, when Peoria workers were first organized. Over the following 4 decades, strikes had occurred repeatedly, each more damaging than the last. In 1961, 12,600 workers walked out for 8 days. In 1979, a strike lasted 80 days. Each negotiation cycle had left deeper scars and higher costs. Each contract had added obligations that made sense in the context of Caterpillar's mid-century dominance and made no sense at all in the context of a competitor producing comparable machines for half the cost. The third crisis was cyclical but severe. A global recession in 1982 contracted demand for heavy equipment across every sector simultaneously. American construction stopped. Mining decelerated. The oil industry, which had driven a massive boom in excavation equipment during the late 1970s offshore drilling surge, entered crisis when oil prices collapsed. Caterpillar's revenues fell sharply. In January 1983, the company announced its first annual loss in over 50 years of history, running at a rate of nearly $1 million per day. The announcement landed in Peoria like a physical blow. Workers were laid off en masse. The company closed approximately 20% of its factory floor space between 1983 and 1985. New plant construction was halted. The company contracted inward, focused entirely on survival, and it was at precisely this moment of maximum vulnerability that Komatsu opened a manufacturing plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee, inside the United States. A joint venture between Komatsu and Dresser Industries went further and installed a production facility in Peoria, Illinois itself. In the city that had been Caterpillar's home for over half a century, a Japanese competitor was now manufacturing machines on the same streets where Caterpillar had been born. It was one of the more humiliating moments in American industrial history, and it was almost completely ignored by the national press. Restructuring, war, and transformation. Caterpillar's leadership responded with measures that were difficult, costly, and, in hindsight, probably unavoidable. In 1985, the company launched the plant with a future program, a $600 million factory modernization initiative designed to automate manufacturing processes and permanently reduce labor requirements. Approximately 2,300 workers were removed from the payroll in that year alone. Production functions previously performed in Peoria were transferred to facilities in Scotland and Japan. The company argued, correctly, that the strong dollar made this reallocation necessary for survival. The workers of Illinois heard a different message. Their jobs were expendable when the numbers stopped working in their favor. The 205-day strike of 1982 to 1983, the longest in UAW history to that point. Ended with a contract that froze wages and reduced job classifications in the Peoria factory from 418 to 50. It was a corporate restructuring packaged as a labor settlement, and union leaders knew it. The UAW left those negotiations with a defeat that its own officials described in those terms. In 1986, the company made a symbolic decision whose implications went beyond symbolism.